Hello, Year 12. Welcome back after Easter. I hope you've had a really nice time and everyone is well and your family is well and you've had some time to chill out over Easter and get your head around this weirdy world that we now seem to be living in. Our topic for government politics this week is where does sovereignty lie in the British government system? Now, this is quite a tricky question, and it's one that you'll see if you're keeping an eye out in the press and on podcasts and things like that, you'll see it discussed quite a bit. So there are very differing opinions on this. It's a tricky question, but it's a really interesting one, and it pulls in all the knowledge from all the different bits of our course all in one place, really, because we're thinking here about how the different branches link together. We're thinking about the Constitution, we're thinking about Parliament, we're thinking about the executive. So it pulls everything, all of the bits we've done so far, all into one place, really. The first thing we need to do is we need to define the two different kinds of sovereignty we're talking about. The first is legal sovereignty, and that refers to where sovereignty lies in theory. Now, in theory, sovereignty lies with Parliament. And if we were standing in a classroom, I'd be saying legal sovereignty refers to where sovereignty lies, and sovereignty lies with, and you'll all be shouting back at me, Parliament. Okay? That's definitely the legal situation. Now, there's the other question, which is on political sovereignty. And that refers to where sovereignty lies in reality. So often sovereignty lies with the government, but not always. So the question there is really where power lies at any particular time, and that's really what we're going to spend most of our time thinking about. Now, when we think first of all about legal sovereignty, if we were in America, thinking about where legal sovereignty is would be really easy because the answer is written in a codified and entrenched constitution. So we would go to find that piece of paper, you look up where sovereignty lies, and it tells you where it lies, easy peasy. In our system, it's not that easy. The Constitution is very messy, but there is always only one answer when it comes to legal sovereignty. And the answer is, of course, everybody ready? Parliament is sovereign. So any essay you write on parliamentary sovereignty, that phrase needs to come into it. Okay, in terms of legal sovereignty, Parliament is sovereign. Now, when we think about political sovereignty, where sovereignty lies in reality, this is much more difficult, partly because our constitution is uncodified, it's unentrenched, and as you're going to see, there's actually been quite a lot of little shifts in this just in very recent years, since you started your A-level course, in fact. So we're going to think now about what challenges parliamentary sovereignty. And the first thing I want you to do, I want you to pause the video and I want you to read the two sheets that I've scanned in and attached to this lesson. So press pause now, read the sheets, highlight all the key vocab, look up any words you're not sure of, and then come back when you're ready. Okay, so now we're thinking here, we're going to go through all the different things that some people say challenge parliamentary sovereignty. Now we're thinking here about political sovereignty, thinking about what things undermine Parliament's ability to have sovereignty, to have that ultimate power that no one can override. First question is devolution. Often referred to as quasi-federalism. So what we're saying here is that Parliament has chosen to share their sovereignty. They've chosen to share power with the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly and the Northern Irish Assembly. And it's called quasi-federalism because people often say that it is inconceivable that Parliament could take the power back. That although in theory Parliament can take that power back and therefore they retain sovereignty, you simply can't imagine that happening. Now, the thing about that is that when I was your age and writing my own government politics A-level many moons ago, I know for a fact that I was sitting writing essays saying that we have chosen to share sovereignty with the European Union, and although in theory Parliament has the right to take that power back, it's inconceivable. You cannot imagine a situation in which the UK would choose to leave the EU. Now, I remember writing that, and that was a pretty standard answer. I didn't have particularly radical views at the time. So I think although that is the case at the moment, that it is inconceivable that Parliament would take those powers back, definitely a case of never say never. These things can change and shift. So at the moment, I would say that Parliament has chosen to share powers with those devolved assemblies and to share functions with those assemblies, but sovereignty, ultimate power, that remains squarely with Parliament. Now, the next one is the electorate. So when there is an election, every 4 or 5 years usually, sovereignty is given back to the electorate. And that is most obviously seen because Parliament is dissolved. There is a prorogation of Parliament. All the MPs, they go back to their constituencies to fight for their seats. There is no Parliament for that time because sovereignty is given to the electorate. And when we talk about parliamentary sovereignty, really what we're meaning is that the electorate, through the process of the election, have chosen to give their sovereignty to Parliament. So for those, usually it's about 6 weeks. For those 6 weeks, the electorate has sovereignty because they're choosing Parliament. In between that, the electorate doesn't. They have influence and they have a job to do or should do in terms of scrutinising what their politicians are doing, but sovereignty, no. So the electorate has sovereignty when there's an election on, not at other times. Membership of the EU. So this used to be a big part of this kind of discussion. Of course, not anymore because Parliament has chosen to leave the EU. At the moment, the powers that we chose to share with the EU are still retained by the EU for a temporary period until the end of the year. I did wonder if the impact of COVID-19 would extend that, but at the moment the government's saying definitely not. So membership of the EU, similarly to devolution, powers were shared with the EU. Sovereignty ultimately was not because Parliament could and did choose to take that power back. The next question is the executive. Now, this is often a discussion amongst political commentators that the executive have too much power. If the executive have a large parliamentary majority, for example, you can see that they dominate Parliament. And at the moment, Boris Johnson could be said to have what you've discussed with Mrs. Thorne, an elected dictatorship. Boris Johnson has such a big majority that he can really do whatever he likes. So does that mean that sovereignty really lies with Boris Johnson? Well, in terms of legal sovereignty, of course, still no. Parliament could choose to curtail his freedom to act, and Parliament could choose to say no to him. It's unlikely because he has such a big majority. But in effect, Parliament has given Boris Johnson a great deal of power. The electorate, through their choice, have chosen to give Boris Johnson a great deal of power because they gave him a very significant majority. But ultimate power remains with Parliament. If Boris Johnson were to go completely off the wall and start doing stuff that's completely crazy, probably the Conservative Party would act before Parliament did, but Parliament could act. And we saw in Boris Johnson's government before the 2019 election, of course, that Parliament often acted against the electorate, against the executive. So Parliament, for example, prevented Theresa May and then Boris Johnson from getting their EU deals through. Parliament forced Boris Johnson to write to the European Union asking for an extension, much against his wishes. So has sovereignty been given to the executive? Does the executive take sovereignty? I would argue that no, the executive has a great deal of power, but the amount of power they have depends on their majority, and sovereignty, ultimate power, remains with Parliament. Okay, so next up is the Human Rights Act. Now, the Human Rights Act is just an act of Parliament like any other. So if the executive are doing things that contravene the Human Rights Act, those actions will be struck down by the courts under the Human Rights Act. So the courts are using the Human Rights Act to stop the executive doing things that break the Human Rights Act. But the courts don't have the right to curtail the behaviour of Parliament, of legislation from Parliament. So with the Human Rights Act, I would say that Parliament retains sovereignty because they can just change the Human Rights Act. If they don't like it anymore, they'll just change it, or they'll make changes to it. Okay, so the Human Rights Act doesn't restrict the sovereignty of Parliament, it restricts the powers of other organisations. Now, globalisation is a difficult one, and this is a really big topic. Whole A-levels are in fact written about this, let alone a large number of books. The idea that globalisation challenges parliamentary sovereignty is saying that we are so interconnected that the idea that any one country or any one body within a country has sovereignty is absurd, and we would simply be kidding ourselves. because we're so interconnected and our economies are so interconnected that none of us really have sovereignty, complete power over our actions anymore. Let's have a look, for example, at the moment, the government's efforts to try and procure PPE, personal protective equipment for the NHS and for care workers. The government has repeatedly said they want the NHS and they want care workers to have personal protective equipment. And they've said that they will have personal protective equipment. And there is enormous pressure from the media for this. And Parliament has been very supportive of this, that they want to have lots of PPE. Why can't they do it? Because in effect they can't. Because all that PPE, almost all of it, is coming from China and they can't physically get it. So the globalization of our economy, the fact that so many products are coming from other countries mean that we don't have sovereignty in effect because we can't actually do stuff. We can't actually provide enough PPE right at this moment because we can't physically lay our hands on the stuff. So the globalization of the economy undermines sovereignty. Another really good example is the oil industry. 1973, the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC, cut the production of oil, and that was in protest at America's support of Israel in Israel's wars with surrounding Arab nations. So they cut the production of oil, which meant that the price of oil went through the roof, went up very high, and people couldn't get hold of oil. So all of a sudden, there were all sorts of things were happening in this country. So, for example, there was a 50 miles per hour speed limit on the motorways to cut how much petrol people were using. Only the TV in the evening, people couldn't watch TV in the evening. Lots and lots of people were working only a 3-day week because there wasn't enough oil to power everything. So this was a war that we had very limited involvement in the Middle East. And an organisation of countries, the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries, had cut the production of oil in order to harm America, but the impact on us were enormous, and we had absolutely no power over that situation at all. So this is another example of where the globalisation of the economy undermines parliamentary sovereignty because it undermines our national sovereignty to act as we might wish to. If you're interested in that, I can supply lots of other reading on that. It's a really interesting thing to look at. Be very careful looking at globalization, its impact on political systems on the internet, because there's a lot of conspiracy theorists and the like out there. So just be careful with that. Now, the Supreme Court has been accused in some sections of the press of undermining parliamentary sovereignty. I think that's completely wrong. I think the Supreme Court has acted in defence of parliamentary sovereignty repeatedly. Gina Miller case being the first example. The Gina Miller case, the Supreme Court said that the executive could not trigger Article 50 without seeking the approval of Parliament. So they were emphasising the sovereignty of Parliament by not allowing the executive to breach that sovereignty. The prorogation of Parliament is another good example. So there, Boris Johnson had prorogued Parliament under his royal prerogative powers. And the Supreme Court said that he had abused those powers and therefore did not allow him to do it. So they said that that decision didn't hold effect. So the Supreme Court, again, was defending parliamentary sovereignty against misuse of the royal prerogative. Referenda is another one. There's increasing use of referendum in this country, particularly when it comes to matters of constitutional change. I think the Gina Miller case has made it quite clear that the executive cannot act on the results of referenda without going through Parliament. So again, I don't think referenda do challenge parliamentary sovereignty. They influence the behaviour of Parliament, but it doesn't affect ultimate power. So when we try and stick this all together, maybe it makes sense that although legal sovereignty lies solidly with Parliament, political sovereignty lies in different places at different times. At elections and at a referendum, it lies with the people. But, of course, a referendum must then be acted on by Parliament. When there are proposed constitutional changes, again, it goes to the people because there's a referenda, although, again, that must still go through Parliament. Often, sovereignty lies, or power and sovereignty lie with the government. They have royal prerogative powers that come directly to the Prime Minister from the Queen, but this has its limits, as we've seen with the prorogation of Parliament. If the executive misuse that power, the Supreme Court will step in to protect the sovereignty of Parliament. So they have a lot of power through the royal prerogative, but really only as long as it's not abused. And for many things, it often depends on the government's power over Parliament. At the moment, the executive have an enormous amount of power, but I would say not sovereignty, not ultimate power. Theresa May and Boris Johnson before 2019, very limited power because they didn't have a majority. So how much power lies with the government really depends on their majority. For matters relating to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, sovereignty lies, a lot of power has been given to devolved assemblies. To my mind, I think it makes more sense to say that power and functions have been given to devolved assemblies, but not sovereignty, because that sovereignty can be taken back by Parliament. At the moment, it's inconceivable that could happen, but as we've seen with the EU, these things can change. Determining who is in the government. The Prime Minister gets to do that. He has that under royal prerogative powers. Parliament has no right to interfere in that. Unlike the American system, where Congress has to approve all such appointments, the Prime Minister has that right. If the Prime Minister were to massively abuse that right in some way by appointing his friends who are not members of Parliament in any way, I think probably the Supreme Court would rein that in. But in terms of practically who decides who goes in the government, the Prime Minister decides that. In terms of military action, that's now with Parliament. That's a convention that has come about since the Syrian civil war. In theory, in a major crisis, the monarch would have sovereignty if politicians were unable to act. Now, I just would emphasise, do not make a big deal of this in any kind of essay. It's a very theoretical power. I think if the monarch, it's a bit like the royal prerogative powers. If the monarch were to overstep the mark, if the monarch were to abuse their position, I have no doubt that action would be taken by Parliament in order to rein those powers in. So it's a very theoretical power, so I really wouldn't make a big deal of that. Where does it not lie? As I've said, with the courts. There's a lot of talk about this in the press, so look out for that. But think about what the Gina Miller case and the prorogation of Parliament ruling actually said, and I think it's clear to me that the courts have not undermined parliamentary sovereignty. The courts have reinforced parliamentary sovereignty. So what I would like you to do now, having done your reading and listen to me, I would like you to plan an essay. This is a 30-mark essay. Evaluate the extent to which parliamentary sovereignty still exists in the United Kingdom. And you can see on here, I want you to put your overall answer in here. You have to decide your answer before you start. I want 2 agree boxes that agree with the idea that parliamentary sovereignty does still exist, and 2 disagree boxes here, and your overall conclusion. Okay, you can do it if you're aiming for A's, and I will put your overall answer here, and then you have paragraphs that support your overall answer here. Okay, and then acknowledge arguments that challenge your overall answer here. Now, if the 2-2 organisation, 2 agree, 2 disagree, doesn't work for you, you want 3 paragraphs that support your answer, and 1 acknowledging that some people disagree with you, that's completely fine. Just redraw your boxes slightly differently. Okay, this isn't 2 and 2 isn't prescribed by any exam board. Okay, I've just laid it out because that's what kind of suits with this box. You must have some balance. So it's fine to have, if you're not particularly fast writer in an exam, you'd have 2 agree and 1 disagree perhaps. Okay, or you can have 3 agree and 1 disagree. Any of those combinations is fine. 1 paragraph on each side is a bit light. You're not going to get the top marks on that because you're not going to show enough breadth of knowledge. So I'm going to put this as an example of my answer, which won't come as a massive surprise to you. It does not mean at all, of course, that you need to agree with my answer. I'm just putting it here to show you what I want to see. So my answer would be, apart from at elections, legal parliamentary sovereignty remains in the UK, although Parliament has shared some political sovereignty with other bodies. So you can see some nice vocab in here. Legal sovereignty is remains. Political sovereignty has been shared. Now, in my first paragraph, I would be talking about parliamentary sovereignty has been re-emphasised in recent months, and I would talk about the Gina Miller case, the ruling of the prorogation of Parliament, and I would talk about the examples of Parliament taking control over the Brexit timetable and the debate before the 2019 election, the Yvette Cooper and Dominic Grieve Amendment to the Withdrawal Bill, commonly referred to by Brexiteers as a surrender bill, that forced Boris Johnson to write to the EU asking for an extension. Or remember, he made it quite clear he didn't really want to. So I would then be concluding Therefore, Parliament has demonstrated that it can, when it wishes, take control of the political agenda, and sovereignty has been re-emphasised by the Supreme Court. That would be my first paragraph. Okay, you're welcome to use that if you want to. If you don't agree with me, that's also completely fine. And so you'd need to organise your own paragraphs. Now, what I would like, please, from everybody is I want emailed to me before the end of this coming week this essay plan along these lines with very clear points like this. 3 bits of factual knowledge you're going to use in each paragraph, and a last line of the paragraph, and an overall answer at the top and at the bottom. Okay, and I want you to send me this essay plan so I can assess how well people have understood the lesson. We have now finished everything on the AS course, and so all of that is finished, and we'll be moving on to new stuff next week, which is quite exciting. I think we're going to move on to America, actually, but I'll talk more about that next week. Please keep in touch. Those who've been doing a fantastic job of sending me work and emailing me whenever you've got queries and things, which is just brilliant. A massive well done to those people. You know who you are. Round of applause. Well done. Some of you I have not heard from yet. Please get in touch. If you're struggling with the work, just let me know. I'm really happy to help and support people. But if you're just not getting on with it, you know, you need to get in touch. Okay? Cannot just have week after week when we're not doing any work, not having your understanding checked. Okay, so please get in touch this week, either way. Okay, I will be back next week. Email me with any queries, and hoping everybody's well. Happy week, everybody.